Chapter 46. After we'd settled in, Mama cooked some rice and we had dinner together. We spoke in low tones, acutely aware that everything we said could be heard by everyone else in the building. And when no one in our quarters spoke, we could pick up on several other conversations around us. It was an odd experience, and it took time for us to adjust to it. My bed was placed beside the brick wall near the rear of our quarters. When I went to bed that night, I lay quietly in the dark, listening to the voices of others in the building as they prepared to sleep. When there were no more voices, I heard something very near me, just on the other side of the wall, separating us from our neighbors. It was soft, labored breathing. I listened and thought I heard sniffles. Someone was sitting or lying in the dark, only inches away from me on the other side of the wall. I whispered, "Are you there?" The sniffling stopped. There was no sound. I sat up and put my ear against the reed mat. A girl's voice came back. "Yes." "Are you crying?" I whispered. "No," she choked. Then she said, "You moved in today, didn't you?" "Yes, I heard you." "What's your name?" I asked. "Chen Yuanyu." "What's yours?" "Wu Yi Mao." "How old are you?" "I'm 15, I whispered. "How old are you?" "I'm 16, she said. Another voice from her side of the wall said, "Shut up and go to sleep." I lay back down and said nothing more to her that night. The following night, we spoke for a few minutes. I told her I'd see her in school and we could talk more then. On our third day in Wuhu, I went to school. I carefully braided my hair, washed my face, and put on clean trousers and a flowered blouse. My heart was pounding with excitement. The school, which was called Fuzhong High School, was affiliated with the university. It was about 1 mile from our new home. Yiding and I brought the official papers Papa had given us, authorizing our transfer. The school grounds were alive with hundreds of students running around, carrying books, talking, or playing. They were nicely dressed and freshly scrubbed, unlike the students in the countryside. We hurried to the administration office and handed in our papers and received our classroom assignments. By the time I arrived at classroom, most of the students were seated at their desks. I immediately noticed the large number of girls. Of about 80 students, at least half were girls. I was delighted and smiled brightly. In the countryside, I'd had few classmates that are girls. The teacher was writing on the blackboard. I stepped through the door, and the students stopped talking and stared at me. The teacher, wondering what had caused the sudden silence, ceased writing and turned to me. She was short, only about 5 feet tall, slender, and middle-aged. She had short hair and wore round, plastic-rimmed glasses that made her stern expression seem almost forbidding. I said cheerfully, "Good morning, teacher." I looked around for an empty seat. I wanted to hurry to sit down and join the other students. She glared icily at me without responding. As I started to walk to a seat, she stepped in front of me. She glowered and pointed to my feet. "Where are your shoes?" she asked. "Go home and put on shoes before you come into my classroom." I was puzzled. In the countryside, I never wore shoes unless it was snowing or cold. Shoes were for special occasions. I looked around at the other students and noticed that every one of them was wearing shoes. I was deeply shamed. I felt my face burn. I bit my lip to stop myself from breaking into tears. The students continued staring at me. Some tittered. My body tightened. I looked at the floor. "Go!" the teacher ordered. "Now!" She extended her hand, palm down, and flicked her fingers at me as if expelling a fly. I backed out of the room. The teacher shut the door in my face. She said something to the class, and her words were followed by an explosion of laughter from the students. I left the school grounds and wandered around almost in a daze. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I didn't own a pair of shoes, and I didn't have the money to buy a pair. I couldn't ask my parents to buy me shoes. After the expense of moving to Wuhu, we had almost no money. Mama had depleted our savings searching for a position for Papa, and they would receive no pay for several weeks. I ended up meandering through a street market several blocks from the school. Peasants from nearby villages sold their wares without government approval on this black market. They bargained boisterously with hundreds of city people. I walked around the market, listening and watching. Before long, I found myself standing in front of a dingy storefront. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Buying old newspapers, old books, old rubber shoes, empty toothpaste tubes, and hair." I went in. It was so dark, I had to blink several times before I could see clearly. The room was small, only a few feet square. It smelled like charcoal and decaying food and tobacco. My first instinct was to turn and walk away. Yet I hesitated. Through a haze of blue tobacco smoke, I saw the shopkeeper sitting on a stool at a small round table. He stood and hobbled toward me. He was very old and hunched over. He wore an old-fashioned gray gown and a black skull cap. A long stem pipe protruded from the corner of his mouth. He was a few inches shorter than me, his ancient wrinkled face at the level of my chin. He reached out slowly, as if not to frighten me, and gently touched one of my long braids. "Are you here to sell your hair?" he asked in a wavering, shrill voice. I stepped back, just out of his reach. I paused before whispering, "Yes." My heart was crying no, but my lips said yes. The word seemed to pop out on its own. The old man returned to the table and picked up something and said, "Come here." I stepped into the shaft of sunshine that entered through a small window. I saw him holding a pair of large iron scissors. He grasped one of my braids, lifted in the air, twisted, examined it closely, tested the weight and thickness, and said, "Oh, goodness, this is thick and heavy. Very good." I didn't say anything. I was still thinking about leaving the shop without selling my hair. "4 yuan," he said, "2 for each braid." I pulled my braid from his grasp and stuck out my chin and declared, "5 yuan for both." His brow wrinkled as he considered my offer. "Okay," he said, 5 yuan. He grasped my left braid and pulled it taut. He held the blades of the scissors at the top of the braid and began slicing. I closed my eyes. The scissors squeaked as they opened and closed. I was hurting inside. I wanted to scream, but I stood still. "Such good hair," he said, as one braid came free and he threw it toward a bamboo basket. He held the other braid, pulled it tight and cut. As it fell loose, I opened my eyes and watched him toss it also. He laid the scissors on the table, opened a little tin box, withdrew a 5 yuan note, and handed it to me. I folded the bill into a small square and clutched it tightly in my fist. I looked over his shoulder and saw my beautiful braids draped over the edge of his basket. My heart ached. I turned and stumbled out of the shop. I felt almost naked without my braids. I returned to the market and moved from stand to stand until I found a vendor selling shoes. I spotted a pair of black plastic shoes for 4 yuan and 50 fun. I thought they might last longer than cloth shoes, and they were cheaper. "I'd like to buy shoes," I said to the clerk. She gave me an unfriendly look. "What size?" she snapped. I had no idea what size. I had not purchased shoes in 5 years. "I don't know," I said. She looked at my bare feet. 38, she said. She pulled a pair from a pile and dropped them on the counter. I held one against my foot and saw it was far too large. Not my size. I need smaller ones. Are you buying shoes or not? She said impatiently. Do you even have money? You don't look like you have money. Buy this or leave. I thought for a moment and concluded I could grow into them. Perhaps it was wise to buy shoes too large. I opened my fist and dropped the 5-yuan note on the counter. She gingerly picked up the wadded bill as if it were too dirty for her. She smoothed it out and held it to the light to see if it was real. She slapped my change on the counter and turned her back to me. I dropped the shoes on the ground and easily slipped into them. It felt strange walking in the shoes for the first time in years. I returned to school without my braids, but with new shoes. Outside the classroom, I used my fingers to comb through my hair and make myself presentable. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open and entered the room. All eyes turned to me. The teacher moved several steps in my direction, recognized me, and immediately lowered her gaze to my feet. Proudly, I put my plastic-shod left foot. At that moment, it seemed to me the teacher suppressed a smile. She asked for my papers. I handed them to her. Her eyes widened when she saw that one of the documents I carried was my Communist Youth League membership. She pointed to an empty chair and said, "Sit there." Students leaned out of their seats to look at my feet as I passed. Seeing my new shoes, they smiled and whispered to those who could not see. I sat down between 2 other girls. Each smiled at me. I smiled back. The recitation resumed. I'd memorized the lines long ago and joined with the others. The world is yours, as well as ours, but in the last analysis, it is yours. You young people, full of vigor and vitality, are in the bloom of life. Like the sun at 8 or 9 in the morning, our hope is placed on you. The world belongs to you. China's future belongs to you. At lunch recess, the teacher called me aside and told me that a meeting of the Chinese Youth League was to take place after class. Since you were already a member at another school, you are in this chapter now. So I stayed after school for the meeting. There were 7 Chinese Youth League members in my class. They welcomed me to their rank warmly. In only a few hours, thanks to my plastic shoes and my Chinese Youth League membership, I had gone from being an outsider to being an insider. Our group leader was named Zhou Yongzhong, meaning forever loyal to Chairman Mao. 3 girls and 4 boys made up the group. I was asked what my CYL title had been in the countryside. I said I had no title. We were all just comrades. But in the city, I was told, each member had a title and a delegated function. There was a group leader, a class monitor, a political commissar, and arts and activities commissar, and so on. The group decided I should be the study commissar of my class, which was the least political position. I would keep the job until I was proved read enough. My duties, they said, were to collect student homework and take roll in the morning for the teacher. The night when I went to bed, I again heard soft cries from the other side of the wall. 元玉, I whispered. Yes, I didn't see you in school today, and I didn't see you. When can we meet? Can you show me the street market? Yes. Why do you cry at night, Yuan Yu? Before she could answer, a voice bellowed, Shut up! From other quarters, near the end of the building, a man's voice rang out. Let us sleep! Be quiet! Neither of us spoke for several minutes. See you tomorrow, I whispered, as low as possible. Yuan Yu scratched an acknowledgement on the reed mat that separated us. The next day at school was quite exceptional for me. Everybody was dressed nicely, though it was clear I was a peasant with my frayed and ill-fitted shirt and trousers. Nobody mentioned it. But they looked at me with curiosity, as though I were some strange creature. They knew I was a country bumpkin, and many still shied away from me. Yet I stood before the class that morning, and each morning after that, and called the list of names to take attendance. I shouted out each name. There were 82 students in the class, and each responded, Here. If anyone was absent or late, I marked down the name for my report. Students took notice. Country bumpkin or not, I wielded authority in the classroom, and I was a member of the Chinese Youth League. At the end of the semester, I drew up a list of those who had been absent or late. The list was put on the wall for everyone to see. Because of my position, the other students warmed to me quickly. Test results were posted on the bulletin board, and when I scored at the top of my class consistently, this focused additional favorable attention on me. At the end of the first school year, the teachers handed out report cards with their comments. They customarily wrote something like, can hold high the banner of Mao Zedong thought, or studied hard. But my teacher added one special comment. A country girl who learned to wear shoes. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47. One of our duties as CYL cadres was to visit the families of students in their homes. We were supposed to communicate with the parents regarding what was happening in school. At the same time, we were directed to observe the home environment for any irregularities, and, if we found them, to report them to higher cadres in the league. At least 2 of us were required to go on each home visit. My first home visits were uneventful and not memorable. Parents were commonly very formal in greeting us and in listening to our reports on their child's performance in school. Nothing seemed amiss in the homes, no suspicious books or pictures, and nothing else to indicate that the parents were anything other than model citizens. During my 4th weekend of home visits, however, I was shaken by our final call of the day. Accompanied by another girl, Xu Yuqing, I completed half a dozen routine home visits. Late in the afternoon, we were supposed to visit the home of a girl named Zhou Jing. Her name meant crystal. She was among the top students in our class. She never volunteered to answer a question in class, yet when called upon, she inevitably had the correct answer. She was very shy and quiet and had no close friends. We had difficulty finding where she lived, even though we had the address. We finally found her quarters in a dormitory for Wuhu textile factory workers. The workers were housed in large barracks-like buildings. These were long, squat, brick-walled, tile-roofed structures. There were dozens of doors along the side of the building. Each door opened to a family's living quarters. We knocked on the door of Zhou Jing's apartment, and she answered and invited us in. We stepped into the small, poorly lit room. There was barely space for 2 beds, a stack of trunks in one corner, and a coal stove in the other. I noticed right away that the room was neat and clean. The beds were made, the floor was swept, and a picture of Chairman Mao was hung high on the wall. Zhou Jing sat down on one of the beds and asked us to sit on the other. After sitting down, I noticed a woman standing in a shadow in the corner. When we were seated, she quietly came forward and sat beside Zhou Jing. I flinched as she approached. Her appearance was utterly horrifying. The entire right face of her face was a purple and blue twisted scar. The eye on that side was bloodshot and watery. The left side of her face was quite beautiful, and the eye on that side was entirely normal. I felt my jaw drop open. I felt lightheaded and was tempted to rise and leave. We sat silently. The woman looked at me and then my partner. She saw the look of shock on our faces. Finally, she said in a low, almost toneless voice, "What?" "I am Wu Mao," I said. I had to clear my throat before I continue. "And this is Xu Yuqing. We are cadre from Zhou Jing's class. We are here for a family visit," I said in a tremulous voice. Zhou Jing said, self-consciously, "These are my classmates, Mama." I was so stunned by the woman's appearance that I simply could not continue. I sat gasping at her face, that unnerving combination of beauty and ugliness. After a long, awkward silence, Xu Yuqing said, "We would like you to know that Zhou Jing has been excellent in her studies, and she participates in school activities productively." "It's good to hear this," her mother said. "Thank you for coming." We have never had visitors before, so excuse me for being nervous. You are cadre. You are important people. She waited for us to reply, but neither of us said a word. When the woman realized we were tongue-tied, she continued, "Let me tell you, since you're cadre, what life is like for Zhou Jing and me." She looked straight into my eyes, as if telling her story to me alone. "Look at my face," she said. Of course, I could do nothing else. I was not born like this. She watched for our reaction. We were glued to every word, and we wanted desperately to hear her story. But at the same time, it was painful to see and to hear. Her left eye blinked. The right eye did not move, but maintained a steady gaze. "When I was your age, I didn't go to school. I wanted to, but I could not. I'm from a poor family. I was sent to work in the factory when I was 12. I worked at the textile factory throughout my teenage years. I was good at my job, and I was a pretty girl, as you can tell from the left side of my face. In fact, the textile factory employed many pretty young girls, but I was considered the prettiest of them all." At the end of the shift each evening, there were always boys waiting at the gate to flirt with us. I had many handsome boys chasing me. As she said this, there was a glint in her eye, and the hint of a smile crossed half of her face. She had been emotionless, but as she remembered what she once looked like, she came alive. I had several marriage proposals, but I always thought I could do better. I turned them all down. I waited for someone special. Because I was a good worker, I was soon promoted to supervisor. I walked around the shop, checking everyone else's work. One day, one of the large machines froze. I had been working there so long, I knew a lot about weaving machines. And since it took forever for the mechanic to arrive when there was a problem, I decided to fix it myself. I began poking around inside the device, trying to see where the problem was. Suddenly, it started. Like a wild animal, it had just awakened. I have only a vague memory of what happened next. All I remember clearly is that 1 second I was looking inside the machine, and the next, I was in the hospital. I was told that the machine inexplicably kicked into life. It caught one of my long braids and pulled it in and ripped off my entire scalp. Half of the skin on my face went with it. I was lucky, they said. Someone else stopped the machine, or it would have torn my entire head from my body. Many times since then, I've wondered if that might not have been better. Who can tell? When she said this, Zhou Jing touched her hand, and she grasped it and squeezed it. Each began sobbing. The woman released her daughter's hand, dabbed at her tears with a handkerchief, composed herself, and continued. I was in the hospital for 7 weeks. They could not let me look in the mirror. My face was wrapped with bandages. I was fed through a tube. I had no idea what to expect. I hoped for the best. I never could have imagined how horribly I had been injured. I could, however, watch the expressions on the faces of the nurses and doctors who attended me when my bandages were changed. They were sickened by what they saw. And so the day arrived when the bandages were removed and I was allowed to see myself. A nurse handed me a mirror, and I held it up and looked at myself. Who is that? I wondered. Who is that? I put the mirror down. I must be having a nightmare. I waited for a moment and held it up a second time. I moved my lips to make sure it was me in the mirror. It was. I nearly passed out. I had gone from being the most beautiful girl in the factory to being the ugliest girl in the world. I had become a monster. Boys stayed away from me after that. There was no one to talk to me, approach me, or, of course, date me. You can never imagine how lonely and empty my life became. My girlfriends, the ones who remained my girlfriends anyway, worried that I might take my own life. A friend of a friend, however, said she knew this man who worked at Anhui Teachers University. He was instructor there. He had a bad family background and he could not find no wife. He had few friends. My friends said, "Listen, he is a nice person. He will not mind your looks. He will see what's inside you. He wants to meet you." I bought a wig. I bought a scarf. I did what I could to look, well, human. Human! And I stilled my emotions and agreed to meet him. He'd been warned about my looks. He didn't express shock. He was kind. We got along well. He could look into my face, what remained of it, and talk to me sweetly. I told him the story of my life. He listened sympathetically. When I cried, he dried my tears. He came back to me, and after we'd seen each other for several months and talked for hours, we decided to marry. He brought me something I thought I'd never have again. He brought me happiness. Within weeks of our marriage, I became pregnant. But then the great leap forward began, and my husband found himself in political trouble. He was labeled a rightist. They came for him and took him away to prison. 1 week after he was taken from me, Zhou Jing was born. She never met her father. 1 year later, in 1959, I was told he'd died in a camp in the northeast. They didn't tell me how he died. They just sent me a piece of paper saying he was dead. He was a good man with a bad fortune. I was mesmerized by her words. In many ways, she was describing my father and our family. I wondered if her husband had been in the same camp with my father. The difference was that my father had survived, and her husband, Zhou Jing's father, had not. I began crying, and so did Xu Yuqing. The mother continued her tale dispassionately, in a low, slow monotone. It was as if she were describing the life of someone else. She seemed to have become numb to the terrible sting of her own words. Those were famine years. We had no food. We had no relatives to turn to. A friend introduced me to the cook in our factory. He was very red, she said. He was from a working class background, but more important, he could feed us. He stole food every day, smuggled it out after his shift, and brought it to us. When he proposed marriage to me, I said yes immediately. What choice did I have? Yet no sooner were we married than he began beating Zhou Jing. Whenever he was unhappy about something, he turned on her and beat her. She was just a little girl. I tried to stop him. I pulled him away, but then he beat me. And when he'd finished beating me, he beat her again. Zhou Jing inherited her father's intellect. She wants to read all the time. She's very quiet. She rarely speaks to anyone. She lives in her own world. She is in love with books, but she needs money to buy her books and clothing. If she asks, her stepfather becomes enraged. As her mother spoke, Zhou Jing held her head lower and wept quietly. Her tears fell to the floor, and her body convulsed. In the last year, it became worse, the mother continued. When he feels like it, he squeezes her breasts and touches her between her legs. But there's not a thing I can do about it, because nobody believes me. He is a worker with a good background. I'm the widow of a rightist. I complained once to the party secretary of his work unit. The man became enraged. No one with his good background would do that, he growled at me. Stop imagining things. If you continue making up rumors about revolutionary workers, I'll have you arrested. That was his advice. You two are in the Communist Youth League. Can you help us? Can you help me? Can you help me? Can you help my child? At that, she bowed her head and wept. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing we could do. Zhou Jing just sat across from me, holding her head in her hands, crying. Zhou Jing's was a cruel fate, but I could not change it. Xu Yiqing and I stood. We thanked Zhou Jing and her mother. They didn't look at us or say a word. They sat together on the bed, desolate and inconsolable. On the way home, neither of us could stop crying. We sat on the bench under a lamp-post and consoled each other. In the next few weeks, I was extra nice to Zhou Jing in school. I tried to draw her out. I gave her pencils and notebooks. One afternoon, I pulled her aside and handed her my treasured copy of David Copperfield. Keep this, Zhou Jing, I said. It has kept me company when I was lonely. Maybe it will be your friend. Following graduation, Zhou Jing was sent down to a distant village. I thought of her often after that, but I never saw her again. End of chapter 47.